In this video, we are going to start adding functionality to our controls on the right hand side. Previous, play and next buttons. If we go back to our editor, the first thing I'm going to do is to go to our template and I'm going to apply some bindings here. I'm going to bind some events to our buttons. The previous button, I'm going to start with the add symbol rather than V on, but you can use either approach. So add and on click, I would like to go to the previous item. So I'm going to call the method called go previous. We don't have this method yet. We will have it in just a moment. Then on our play button, I want to bind the click event to it as well. So on click, what I would like to do is to call play method. Again, this method does not exist yet. Neither does the next one. For next, I'm going to go for click and we're going to call go next method. Now, another thing I want to do is to apply the class to this play button, and it's going to come from the computed property called play class. And this class will be applied to this play button based on a certain condition. That's why it needs to go to the computed properties. So if we scroll down to the computed section, after our swapping class, we are going to create a new one, play class. And again, we could either use old approach, colon and function, then brackets, and everything that we want to call when we actually call this method within this function, or use the ECMAScript 6 approach, which is just the name, brackets, and set of curly brackets. And this is the one, obviously, I'm going to be using here. So return from within this method, and it's going to return an object. It will tell us that I want to apply active class when, exclamation mark, this interval. When we going to start interval, this interval will have a number associated, integer associated with it. So obviously this will evaluate to false, at which point this active class will not apply to this play button. But when we're going to stop it, when we're going to reset this interval to null, this is when this active class will be applied, because this exclamation mark checks whether it's not true, so whether it's false, and obviously null evaluates to false. So this play class will be applied to this button when this interval will equal to null or false. By default, it will be null, and when we start the interval, then it will have an integer associated with it. Okay, now if we scroll down, the next thing we need to do, we have these few new methods which we've just bound to these elements. So after the resume, actually before the pause, let's keep them all together because we have next slide, next. Let's start with the method which was going to the previous slide. So let's call it go previous. And this is the method we associated with the click event on the previous button. So from within this go previous, what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to clear the interval, basically stop the scrolling. So I'm going to start with window, then clear interval. And this clear interval method takes an integer representing the given interval, the interval that we want to clear. So in our case, it's associated with the property this interval. There we go. And now after this, what I want to do is to set this interval to null. So what will now happen? When we click on previous button, we're clearing interval. So we're no longer going to be scrolling through all these items. And we also set this interval to null. Let's quickly scroll up. And as you may remember, if we look at our computed properties, when interval isn't true, in other words, if it's going to be set to null or false, then this active class should apply to this play button, making this play button at full opacity. Okay, if we go back to the terminal, let's quickly compile everything and let's have a look at how it's behaving in a browser. And if we now open a browser, refresh the page, you will see that when we go to the view console, click on horizontal fit, our interval has integer 2 associated with it. If we now click on previous button, look at what's going to happen with this interval. There we go. It's been set to null, and have a look at our scroller. It doesn't scroll anymore. Now our interval has been stopped. There are no more iterations to be going through. And what we need to do now is to make sure that when we've clicked this button, we cleared the interval, but we also moved to the previous item. So if we go back to the editor, what I'm going to do, if we scroll down to the bottom, this functionality here stops the feed. So perhaps we could extract all this to another method. I'm going to cut all this, and after this go previous, I'm going to create a method called stop, and I'm going to paste everything that I've just copied into this method. So this method will be responsible for stopping the scrolling, which means clearing the interval and setting it to null. Now from go previous, I'm going to start with this stop. So we're stopping the scrolling first, and then what we are going to do is call the method called this previous slide. We have next slide method, if we scroll up, but we don't have previous one. So before this go previous, I'm going to create this new previous slide method. And what's going to happen? This previous method will share the same code as this next slide. The only difference will be that we are going to create the previous method in a moment, which will look similar to this next method when we're trying to figure out what's the previous index. And then we will have to make sure that this specific method is called here, associating this new value, this new integer with this current property. Everything else will remain the same. So what I'm going to do is cut everything from within this next slide method, and I'm going to extract it to another method called progress. And this method will take one argument, which will be the direction which we want to take. So direction, and comma, and I'm going to paste everything that I just cut. What I'm going to do here is, rather than keeping this full stop next, I'm going to use square brackets and paste this direction here, and that will call the relevant method which will be represented by this direction. So from within the next slide, I'm going to use next, which we'll call this next method. From the previous slide, I'm going to call it with the previous as a direction. So let's do this. From within the next slide, this progress, and the direction will be next. So passing this next as an argument, then this next method will be called when we associating the value from within this method with this current property. And for the previous slide, the same thing, this progress, and the method will be called previous. So now we've extracted this to a separate method. As you can see, we can use the same method, just passing different argument, which we'll call different method in return. So after this previous slide, let's create this previous method now. So previous, and this method will return the index of the previous item. So we're going to check if this current triple equal symbol 0, which would indicate we are on the first item, then we are going to return this max, which represents the last item in our collection. So if we're on the first item, we want to go to the last one, and if we click previous again, it's going to the next one, before that last one, and so on. Otherwise, if we are not on the first item, then we are going to return this current, and we deduct 1 from it. So that's our previous index. Okay, so now if we save everything, and let's quickly compile it using npm run dev, and if we preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, and let's again go to view console, click on this horizontal fit, have a look at what we've got here, interval 2. If we click on previous, interval changes to null, and we have now changed our item to the previous one. So we on current is 0, which is the first item. If I click previous again, this will take me to the third item, 0, 1, 2, so index 2. And if I click previous again, this takes me to the previous item, item 1, and then item 0 again. So as you can see, our previous button works fine. And as you can see now, this button here is at full opacity, which means that if I was to now preview it in the elements section here, you can see we've got this active class, because if we go back to view, our interval is set to null. That's why this class has been applied. Okay, now doing the next go next method is going to be really easy now. If we go back to the editor, after go previous, let's create this go next method. And go next method will start exactly same way as our go previous. So this stop, we want to make sure that interval has been cleared. And then this next slide, we have this method already available because this is the method which is being called from within the swap method when we setting up the interval. So we don't have to do any more work. So if we now save it, let's quickly compile everything again. And if we now preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and if we click on the horizontal feed again, so going back one, we are on current 2, and then if we go next, that should take us to the first one, index 0, next again, first, second, and so on. Okay, so previous and next buttons are now working, but how can we resume our scrolling? So if we click on this button, obviously nothing happens. Now you can see that we have 2 errors now in the console. We have property or method play is not defined, and so on. So let's quickly go back to the editor, and one last method before we finish this course. It's going to be called play. And from within this method, the first thing I want to do is to check if interval hasn't been set yet. So I'm going to check if this interval, and it would return true only if it wasn't set to null. In other words, if interval has already been set. And if that's the case, we are going to simply call return to terminate the execution of this method. Otherwise, we are going to call this swap, which will start new interval. So if we save it, and again, let's compile everything. And if we preview everything in a browser again, let's refresh the page. Let's open view console, click on the horizontal feed. Current item is 0. Now we're going for the second one at index 1. If we click on next button, look what's going to happen with this middle button. There we go. This becomes active now. And interval has been set to null. If I click previous, interval stays as null. Obviously current changes. But if I click on play button, interval now changes to integer 8. And that should now automatically scroll to the next item. You can now also see that the play button has been grayed out. If I click now, nothing happens because obviously we are first checking from within this play method whether the interval isn't running already. And if it does, then obviously this play button will not do anything. Okay, so that's it in this course. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions or suggestions, please use our comment section.